Okay, we're in Acts today. I know you're tired of me saying that, but you only have to hear me say that one more week, because next week is our last week in Acts. So if you think during this week, oh, what am I supposed to read in Acts? Read the last chapter. That's what's coming up this next week. But this second to last chapter, chapter 27, I got to be honest with you, straight up, commentators don't know why it's in the Bible. Really? Yeah. So I struggled with, should we even study chapter 27? But that's almost sacrilege, because Paul, when he writes to Timothy in a letter in 2 Timothy 3:16, that's how you can remember it. It's like John 3:16. 2 Timothy 3:16, he says, all Scripture is inspired by God. All Scripture is inbreathed by God, and it's profitable for teaching and for reproof and for correction and training in righteousness, that you and I would be totally adequate and equipped for ministry. So all Scripture. So at the beginning of this week, I dove into chapter 27 of Acts, where commentators say, I don't know why this is here. And I said, God, I don't either. So I'll just come into chapter 27, and we'll just read it, and God will allow your Spirit to say something. By the end of the week, I was broken, and you'll see why in a second. So we're just going to jump into it. It is the primary travelogue of the entire New Testament. We're going to get a cool travelogue, and we're going to do it like a travelogue today. So again, here we are. We've been going through all these chapters. We're in 27. We got one more chapter to go, and we're just going to do 27 today and see what's going on. And as you recall from last week, Paul is on his way being sent back to Rome, okay, because he's gotten a lot of hot water with the official religious leaders back in Jerusalem, and the Romans who were trying to untangle this problem decided to have a court, and at the end of that court, Paul, as a Roman citizen, said, I appeal to Caesar, and that's his ticket to have his trial in front of Caesar, and Caesar, of course, lives in Rome. So he's on his way to Rome right now. Yeah.
It's not in Italy, right?
Rome, Italy. Yeah, Rome, Italy. Yeah, that's the place. He's going to Italy. So if you and I were living in Israel and you're on your way to Italy, you'd probably get in a cruise ship, but there's no cruise ships. In fact, this is the worst thing. This is the worst cruise ship on the earth. So let's find out what happens as he tries to get there. We're just going to launch in, and we'll pick up the travelogue. Verse 1 of chapter 27. Well, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, see, there it is. Woo, yep, we're going to Italy. They proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. That's quite a high ranking, it turns out. And embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. So you remember where we're starting from. We're starting from here, from Caesarea. This is an artist rendering based on archaeological records of the seaport of Caesarea. It's kind of in the northern coast of Italy. We've seen this before. Just a wonderful place. By the way, I didn't show you this before. See on the very top of that picture up there, that thing jutting out? That's Herod's house. Yeah, really nice. And to this day, if you go to Israel, Betsy's smiling. She's seen this. If you go to Israel, you can actually go right there where Herod's house is. The whole house is not there, but the foundations are there. And you can walk out there and look around and say, nice place. So he lives way up there. And he could watch all the transactions going on in this artificial port that was built. A very Roman, wonderful place. I call it the Mazatlan of the Roman Empire, which is very much what it was. So this is where Paul is starting from today. And he's going to get in a boat in port here. And he's going to leave port right through these protected barriers at the bottom of the screen. And he's going to go from here on the eastern Mediterranean and head out to Rome. That's where we're going today. So we're leaving Caesarea behind, going to go to Rome. So let's get oriented. Here's our map of the eastern Mediterranean, and it's got all the normal stuff. That's Africa on the bottom. That dark thing on the bottom right is the Nile Delta fan, where the Nile comes up through Egypt. Israel's on the bottom far right. Turkey's on the upper far right over there. Greece is jutting down from the center right there. And Italy is way up there. You remember Italy's a boot? You're seeing the heel and toe of the boot way up there on the upper left. So that's where we're headed today. So we'll take off that. And just to give you an idea for scale, this is the same scale. So this is how big an area we're looking at right here. So there's Western United States, and there's the Mediterranean. So see, that's where we're going to go. We're going to if you did it like this, we're actually going from the Texas Panhandle, which is jutting up on the bottom right. We're going to try and make our way up to northern Oregon in the Mediterranean. So that's how big this distance is. He's going to go in a boat. Okay, so that's where we're going today, and let's see how it goes. Well, he starts out down here in Caesarea, bottom right, and he gets in a boat there, it says, and verse 3, it says, the next day after they left Caesarea, we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. So they go by boat up to Sidon up there, and theoretically, from how he mentions it, Paul's got friends there, and the centurion allows him to be cared for by his friends. So it's a nice first stop on a wonderful cruise to Rome. And it goes downhill from here. So they get to Sidon. They're going up to the bottom. There's the bottom of Italy up there. That's our target. And you would think that the best way to go from Sidon up to Rome would be like that, right? The problem is the winds in the Mediterranean, especially the end of the calendar year, we're somewhere around September or October, we can figure from what Paul's saying, they go the opposite way. They go the other way. So we're not going to go that way today. We're going to have to creep along the shoreline. So verse 4, it says, "From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary." Well, where's Cyprus? It's that island up in the middle right over there. So what they do is they go on the other side of the island so those westerly winds won't be blowing them back into shore. So they go in the shadow of Cyprus and they creep up the coast over there so the winds don't kill them. And then he goes on, says verse 5, "When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia." Where's that? Well, Cilicia and Pamphylia are that bottom part of Turkey right there. They hug the coast and make it finally over to Myra down there. He's been there once before on an earlier trip. So they're working their way that way, and they're trying to stay out of the big westerly winds that's going to just slam them back the direction they came from. He goes on, verse 6, "And there the centurion," the guy who's in charge of the whole thing, "found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. And when we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty, we had arrived in," I think it's Cnidus. I don't know. CNI. So where is that? Right there. So he says, a good many days, which is euphemistic for, man, it took a long time. And that's as far as they got because of these westerly winds. It's a really hard thing. And by the way, he picks up an Alexandrian ship. Alexandria is, geography quiz, down in Egypt, down here. So it turned out at the time the Roman Empire got most of its grain, its wheat and stuff, from Egypt. So there were ships that came from the Alexandrian port and would go across the Mediterranean and go up to Rome. And they actually went under Roman guard because this is how most of the grain got to Rome, is from Alexandria. So they're jumping on an Alexandrian ship that's bound for Rome. It's come up out of Egypt, and it's probably carrying in its hold a ton of wheat. So just lots and lots of. So they're on basically a grain barge is what they are. But it's a big boat, so it's not just a tiny little rowboat. So get that in your mind. And they put us aboard. Many days we just got to Cnidus, or however you say that. Okay, then it goes on. He says, this is why. "Since the wind did not permit us to go farther, so we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon." So where do you go from here? The wind's still pushing you to the right. So they go south, and there's Crete right there. And they basically decide to get behind the shadow of Crete, and Salmon is the most easternmost city there. So he says, what we did, just like we went around Cyprus and we kind of stayed in the shadow of Cyprus to keep the winds from killing us, we went down to Crete and stayed behind Crete, hoping the winds wouldn't push us further out. So that's where they go to. But they don't actually land at Salmon. What they do is they go around it. He says, verse 8, "And with difficulty, sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea." So they come to this bottom port in the city, in the island of Crete, where people named Cretans get their names from. Because people who lived on Crete were known to be lazy and depraved. That was just what they thought at the time. So that's where you get Cretans from, is Crete. So there they land in Fair Havens. The weather's starting to come down. We're in probably last week of September, early October. The weather in the Mediterranean Sea gets so bad that what they do is they shut down all shipping by November 1st. That's how nasty it is. So this is tough. So now you got to make a decision. Do we stay here in Crete and try and get through the winter, because all shipping is going to shut down because it's too hazardous in about 3 weeks? Do we stay here, or do we push on to some place that's safer to winter, but we definitely are not going to make it to Rome before the Mediterranean becomes absolutely deadly? So what do we do? Well, this is what they do. Verse 9, when considerable time had passed, so they stayed in Fair Havens a long time trying to decide, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Listen, guys, men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo, the wheat, and the ship, but also for our lives. And you know, Paul is not a trained sailor, right? He's a trained Pharisee. He's an intellectual. He's an elite intellectual. But he's gone through 3 missionary journeys, all relying on boats. And so Paul is saying, guys, I've been on this place before. We really don't want to get on the water. We want to stay right here. And of course, since he is an intellectual elite, they ignore him. So this is what happens. Verse 11, the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Right? Well, you trust the pilot. The pilot is the one who understands the geography of the sandbars and stuff like that. And the captain's the guy who's done this all. He goes Alexandria to Rome all the time. They're thinking, oh, we can do this. Oh, and by the way, too, since it was a grain barge for Rome, it feeds Rome, it's officially under the command of the centurion. So the centurion makes the decision. The Roman guy in charge makes the decision because this is food for Rome. So what they decide to do is not go all the way to Rome, but something halfway. Verse 12, because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, where they are in Fair Havens, which I think is a nice kind of ironic thing. It's named Fair Havens, but we can't stay here. I never got that. So you can't stay there. The majority reached the decision to put out to sea from there and go to another place on Crete. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, not Arizona, Phoenix, Crete, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So actually they're going to stay on Crete and go to a place that's got a better harbor. There's Phoenix, and they'll just kind of make their way to Phoenix. How hard can that be? We're staying on Crete. Let's just go to a harbor that's not going to get whipped up with all the storms. And they say, yeah, that's a good compromise. Let's go there. Phoenix can't be hard to get to, right? Famous last words. It really goes downhill from here, and they're just trying to stay on the island. Well, let's see what happens. 13. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. So they have a southerly wind, which is coming up from the bottom of the picture. Good, because when we round that little corner of Crete, we'll make our way over to Phoenix. We'll be good. So the south wind comes up, that encourages them, and they creep along the shoreline until, but before very long, that was a great plan. Before very long, they're rushed down from the land, so it's coming from the north, a violent wind called Eurykio, which is if you're on the East Coast and you got the guys who get lobsters up there, there's a thing that they call the nor'easter. Arr! Yeah, look out. So it's a violent wind. That's what they're having right here. It's coming down off the land, and it's pushing them away from Crete. They are this close to a safe port in Phoenix, and this wind comes that pushes them away. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it. We just let go, and we let ourselves be driven along. So instead of heading towards Phoenix, this wind is pushing them down, and what they do is they end up going cattywampus to the south. They're not going where they want to go. And this is a fierce wind now. So how do you got a sailboat. You don't have diesel motors. So you go with it, is what they're saying. So they go with it. Verse 16, running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, and that's that little thing on the bottom left. There's Clauda right there. They get close to that to kind of shield from the wind, to kind of get on the backside, the bottom of it, to shield from that northerly wind. We were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. So they ran out this way and got behind it and continued to go south. I mean, completely away from where they want to go. And by the way, when you see it says the ship's boat, that's not redundant. They're talking about the dinghy. They're talking about the lifeboat that they dragged behind the ship. You know, today you go on a big liner, all the lifeboats are strung up on the side of the boat. What they would do during that day, they would have a safe boat. They would have a lifeboat like that, but they would just put it on a rope behind it. They said it was so bad we couldn't even hold on to our lifeboat. That's how bad it was. So now they're being pushed away from Crete, pushed away from the best safe port they've got for the winter, and that little boat, the dinghy, is out of control even. So after they had hoisted it up, they brought the dinghy actually on board. They used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor. So they take the dinghy, they bring it up on the boat to kind of get safe. It gets really, really nasty, and now they're afraid that they're actually going to bottom out on some of the sandbars that are near North Africa. They're coming towards Libya now, and they realize if we get too close to Libya, we're going to get stuck, and you don't want to have your boat stuck on a sandbar, hundreds of miles from anything as the winter is coming in. That would be certain death. So now they're thinking, oh, we got to get away from the sandbars. So they're being pushed closer and closer to the sandbars near the top of Libya, and now they're really fearing for their lives, so they start jettisoning stuff. They start getting rid of stuff. In this way, they let themselves be driven along, so now what they're doing is they're going down that way, and they're scared they're going to hit that. By the way, that big bump right there, that's Libya, and you've heard the name of this guy, Simon of Cyrene? Cyrene is right on the tip of that bump. That's where it is. So, I mean, that's where they're being driven. So they can't get to safety if they just let the wind continue to push them. They'll be stuck on the sandbarge. There is no National Guard to come save you. You're stuck. You die. That's the end. Winter comes down on you there for months and months and months. So they'll be drifted along. It gets worse. The next day, as we are being violently storm-tossed, and in the Greek, this is a big word, violently storm-tossed. Violently storm-tossed. They began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So the tackle is everything they need to control the ship. They're saying, throw everything off. We got to get lighter, because if you're drafting too deep, you're going to hit the sandbar. So let's get lighter, and let's just throw everything away. So that's what they're doing. It's pretty bad. Think of this. This is a modern-day ship in a nasty piece of weather on the ocean. Now, he's on no small boat. I mean, it's big enough to hold a lot of tonnage of grain and stuff. And in a second, we'll see there's more than 200 people on board. But that would scare me to death. And he's in a tiny little boat in the middle of the Atlantic that's being threatened with being sunk, because it's not watertight, as well as being pushed up on a sandbar and stuck for months and months and months and dying on board through the winter. It's a bad situation. So, what happens? Well, since neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. The storm was so bad, they never saw the sun or the stars. Violently tossed, just thrown wherever the waves are going to throw them. I mean, from a coin toss in their mind, they could either be stuck on a sand thing on the top of Libya, or they could be sunk in the middle Mediterranean. They've got no control. They've thrown all their tackle off. All hope is lost. We're going to die regardless. See why commentators wonder why this is in the Bible? Well, it gets worse. Oh, how can it get worse? Okay, here we go. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. I told you so." But now that's not really an "I told you so." It was really a way of him saying, I really did know what I was talking about. And at this point, his influence with the crew starts to go up, because then they remembered. They remembered what's going on. And keep a close watch at what Paul does at this point. I mean, he's on a ship of people who are convinced they're going to die any second. They're going to die there in the early winter in the Mediterranean that's whipping like that picture. So what do you do as Paul? It's more than just an "I told you so." It's more than "we're all going to die and I told you we would." That's not exactly what's going on, okay? By the way, it says they went a long time without food. We don't know quite why they didn't have food, although most of the speculation goes with the hanging your head over the side of the boat problem. So if you're storm-tossed for that long, say, well, we do have hamburgers down in the hold. I don't want that either. So we think really that's pretty much what it was. It was just so violent, and no one ate for a long time. So now everyone's dehydrated. They haven't eaten for a long time. In a second, we'll see it a couple weeks. And they're figuring they're all going to die. Why should they even eat food? So Paul says in a second here, let's do something about that. So he says, "Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." Wow. You're all going to live. And he goes on, "For this very night an angel of God, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar,'" that's Rome, "and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you." That is, all those people on the boat, he's granted you. They'll be with you. "Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on a certain island." Good news, bad news. Good news is we're all going to live. Bad news is the boat's going to be destroyed. Okay. I know. What? Now you got to picture this. This would make a good movie too. You know, they're being storm-tossed in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. All hope is lost. All tackle is gone. They're chucking stuff over the side. And Paul says, I told you we shouldn't have come out here, but listen for a second. I had a direct communication from God last night, and God said, Paul, I need to send you to Rome. I need to get you to Caesar, and that's going to happen. And, by the way, you will not be the only person who survives on this trip, but everyone with you will as well. But the boat's going to go away. Now, he's standing up saying this in front of people, half of them who are retching over the side of the boat, the other half who are dehydrated and just wallowing on the deck and not knowing what to do. It's a miserable situation, and yet Paul speaks and says, you'll all survive. Don't worry, you'll all survive. Now, that's why he said before this, I told you we shouldn't go out. There's a certain sense of authority that he has. He says, I knew this stuff, but listen to me now. This is what's going to happen, because the God whom I serve and whom I belong to has made a promise to me, and he's always been good to his promises. It's a great word. I don't know whether they accepted it or not, but Paul's trying to give them hope. It's this word right here where he says, take courage. It happened before, and I think he does here too, does he? Keep up your courage. Yeah, that kind of Greek phrase is only used 3 times in the New Testament, and it really is, bad translation, be happy, or, your spirit should be up, because it's good news. You won't die. Yeah, exactly. So he's trying to say you need to look up everything. Everything is not lost. So take courage. Everything's okay. But when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. Now, their greatest fear when approaching land was what? The sandbars at the top of Libya. So they are freaked. They're out at midnight. And so how do they know they're close to land? Well, what we know is they drift this direction, because we know where they're going to end up. And on Google Earth right here, you can see how the seafloor kind of pops up on a shelf right there. They must have come up on that shelf someplace. They're approaching some land. Okay, so here's your Seamanship 101. Why? Because they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. Bing! Actually, the word for taking soundings in the Greek is to drop lead. I love that. Drop lead. You drop lead. So you have a piece of lead at the end of a rope, and the rope is actually marked off. And you just drop lead and you see when it hits the bottom. And in fact, a fathom, you know how far a fathom is? That's a fathom. It actually, a fathom, coming from the Latin, means sort of like to wave your hands. So you take a piece of line and go, and count as you go. And they did 20 of those, got to 20 fathoms. A fathom's about 6 feet. I can stretch 6 feet, 5 to 6 feet. So they find out it's 20 fathoms. Well, that's a little on the shallow side. They're not in deep ocean anymore, but it gets worse, because then what they do is they go a little farther and they take another sounding and find that it's 15 fathoms. We are headed toward the sandbar. So now they're totally freaked. For seamen, 15 fathoms is not much, especially when you're being tossed. So now what are you going to do? Because if you keep going the way you've been going, what's going to happen? You're going to run aground, and you'll be stuck permanently in the middle of the Mediterranean and die in the wintertime. And sick on top of it. Exactly. Oh, the good news is the hold has a lot of wheat. So anyway, fearing that they might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak, because remember, this happens at midnight. But as the sailors are trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat, the dinghy, remember that, into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. So get the picture here. It turns out the sailors are deciding to abandon ship while no one's watching. They take the dinghy, the lifeboat, they put it down in the water in the midnight, in the dark when no one can see them, and they're leaving. We are out of here. That's what they're doing. We are out of here. But Paul said to the centurion, Paul caught him doing this, said to the centurion, who is in charge, not the captain, and to the soldiers, and said, you know what, Mr. Centurion, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. You're losing all of your sailors. They are getting in the dinghy and they're leaving us out here to die. Centurion, you better do something about this. So the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. So what do? They told the guys to get back in the boat who were in the dinghy. They cut the rope that they dragged the dinghy with, said, goodbye, dinghy. We're all staying on this ship. Huh? Wouldn't this make a great movie? We're all staying right here. You guys stay with, you either die with us or you get us out of this. So that's what they're doing. They cut it away. Verse 33, until the day was about to dawn, it was a long night, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying this, today is the 14th day that you've been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Come on, let's eat some, because you need that, because we're going to survive this. We are going to survive this. Not a hair on your head is going to be lost. Let's take some food. Yeah, even you guys who got their heads over the railings. Just come on, we need to eat. You need to preserve yourself. I don't want you dying from lack of food, because God said we're going to survive this. The sea's not going to take us, so don't die from lack of food. Come on, let's eat. So he does that, and he does a wonderful thing right here. Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. And all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. Now, Paul's not actually doing, Last Supper communion right here. He's just breaking bread. He's leading them, saying, come on, let's eat. We'll be okay. And they were greatly encouraged when they ate. So Paul's on this great ministry of just encouraging them. Just eat. Come on. We'll be okay. Not a hair of your head will be found gone. 37, all of us in the ship were 276 persons. 207. So see, this is not a small boat. 276 persons on the boat. And you notice, too, that Luke is writing in the first hand, so he's there as well. Verse 38, and when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. Darn, here's our wheat. So they're still concerned. They're still aiming towards shallows. But they've eaten and said, you know what, we're encouraged. Maybe we will survive this. Let's dump the cargo and maybe we'll get there. We'll get there. So, verse 39, when day came, they couldn't recognize the land. But they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. So in the dimness of what they could see, they can't recognize what landmass they're looking at. These are trained sailors, so they can normally tell by seeing the coastline, but they can't see it. All they can see is a beach, and they figured that's our chance. If we take our boat and we run it up on the beach and we get stuck right there, that's okay, and then we can swim to shore and we'll be safe. So let's just aim this baby right for the beach, and we'll just let the boat go. I mean, they've already lost the cargo. So you don't want to actually end up in Rome and have someone say, great, you survived the storms. Where's all that wheat we depend upon? Oh, we threw it in the sea. So it's better to just bust the boat up. So that's what they're going to do. They're going to just ram the boat out there and get stuck. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea and just cut them off, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders. The rudders are usually tied down until they go straight. They just said, forget it, we'll just go this way. And hoisting the foresail to the wind, they were headed for the beach. So they are just steaming away for the beach now. Here we go, aiming for the beach, trying to run aground. Here's what it looks like. Not quite like that, but it's something like that. So they're actually being driven into the beach by the storm still. This isn't a nice, gentle kind of putt into the beach. The storm is driving them toward it, and they're just letting it do it, just forcing them right in there. So, 41, striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the bow, stuck fast and remained immovable. So the front end got stuck, but the stern, whipping around, began to be broken up by the force of the waves. So they were successful. Good news, bad news. Good news is we got to where we wanted to go to. Bad news is the boat's falling apart. So now we got to get off the boat. So what do you do next? The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. Not a productive part of the plan. But why do they want to do this? Well, because if the soldiers survive, and they're there to guard prisoners, since it's in the plural, presumably more than just Paul, and if they show up in Rome having survived, and they have no prisoners, their punishment is death. They die. So this is surely it's a self-preservation move for the soldiers' part. If they can't guarantee to deliver the prisoners to Rome, then we'll just take them out right here. And that's more honorable than going to Rome and say, well, we lost them in the surf. You don't want to do that. So they're freaked out. They're thinking before everyone starts to swim to shore, let's kill all the prisoners, and then everyone else that can make it to shore, that's okay. But at least we've got our duty done, right? That's what we're going to do. Not very productive. So now we're in another crisis. The centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention. Whew. And commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, presumably those who couldn't swim, should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. So, let's all get into shore and none of this sword fight stuff. Let's just survive the Mediterranean today. So that's what happens. And so it happened, last verse of this chapter, that they all were brought safely to land. Why is this chapter in the Bible? You see what I mean? I prayed about that a lot, and then, oh my gosh. I went back and looked at what Paul did. What did Paul accomplish for God on this trip? I mean, after all, in previous missionary journeys, Paul would travel someplace. It would document where he went to the synagogue and preached. It shows what he preached. Or he'd be in front of the two governors of Palestine whose names were Festus and Felix. We've done this. Get those pictures in your mind, okay? So we see where he's traveled and we see where he's talked and he's proclaimed the gospel. But what did he accomplish on this boat? So I looked back and I went back and picked out what Paul does on the boat. For instance, remember this? While he's still in Fairhaven, men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only for the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. What he did was he brought to bear the wisdom that God had given him about traveling like that. And so he brought a warning of wisdom, saying, listen, if you listen to what I'm saying, you can avoid a lot of heartbreak. So let's not do this. So in a knowledgeable but not a puffed up way, he says, you need to listen to me. This is not safe. He brings wisdom in the midst of a bad thinking situation. Of course, they don't heed the wisdom, but he decides that he needs to assert that. If you fast forward some, in another place he says, remember this encouragement, yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And for this very night, an angel of God to whom I belong to and whom I serve stood up before me, da-da-da-da, and goes on. So what does he do secondarily? Well, in his second thing, he gives them an assurance of truth. He says, I know for certain, based on not my own abilities, but because God himself has revealed it to me, hard fact of truth, that we'll all survive. There's an assurance based on the source of the truth that he has. Now, did they heed that? I don't know. But he's still saying, I have hard assurance from the God that I follow. This is what's going to happen. I give you that truth. You can have assurance if you accept the truth and you accept the source of that truth. You can have assurance in the midst of this really nasty situation. And then he goes on. Another place, he says, unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Don't let the sailors go. We're all going to die. And what's that in general speaking? Well, I realize that's just a way of saying there are words of life. Here's some words for you, Mr. Centurion. Keep the soldiers on the boat, we'll live. And the centurion decides to accept Paul's advice now. So there are words of life that he speaks to the centurion, and as a result, they live. So he has words of life to offer. He goes on, and he says another place, therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from the head of any of you will perish. Encouragement. Remember, he has that encouragement section that happens in the middle there, and they take it and they are encouraged. He says, come on, let's eat. Only people who think they're going to live, eat. If you think you're going to die, forget about it. It's this for your preservation. I want to encourage you, eat. And it goes on, we find out that they are encouraged. Remember, he goes on, having said this, he took bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. And all of them were encouraged. And they themselves also took food. What's this? Thankfulness. He took bread and broke it. He said, you know what? This may seem really crazy to you because it looks like we're all dying, but I have a good reason to be thankful because look, God's provided us food. Yeah, but we're all going to die in the storm. No, we're not. Here's food. So in the midst of this crazy situation, the boat is busting up. It looks like water's going to take us down. We're going to get stuck on a sandbar. Everything's going wrong. We've thrown all the tackle overboard and all that kind of stuff. In the midst of all that, Paul says, we have reason to be thankful. We're all alive, and he's given us bread to preserve us. Let's be thankful. Now that is a very keen difference from what everyone else is thinking on board. So he's thankful in that sense. So here's what I realized. In this storm-tossed thing of life, there's 276 people on board. I say, you know what? Paul never got a chance to actually preach in a synagogue. He never got a chance to preach in front of a governor, or he's never preached in front of Caesar yet. But what he has done is 5 really incredible things so that the people who are stuck in the boat of life with him will realize that there's hope in the God he serves. Did you catch that? And do you know that we are all on a sinking boat together with a lot of people around us who realize the boat is busting up and who realize that despite everything they can do, it looks like we're all doomed to die. And everyone is saying, woe is me, I'm going to die. There's this depression that goes about that. And yet, in the same way that God has taken Paul and stuck him on this ship, he has taken you and put you on this ship that's busting up. And I'm not talking about the church, I'm talking about the whole area we live. I realize that's all God's trying to tell us. Paul, yes, he's a great speaker. He speaks for God well. He presents the gospel well in different contexts. But this is the only view we get to where Paul just lives a natural Christian life of dependence upon God and brings salvation to 276 people in a practical way as he thanks God for their preservation. That is our gospel message to the world. We are on a sinking ship that's being busted apart by the fallen creation, by the prince of the power of the air, whose only desire is to steal, kill, and destroy the boat that we're on. And there's people that wonder, is there hope? Is there salvation? Is there any assurance of truth that I can hang on to that we're not all being destroyed? And despite all my abilities, I'm hopeless. Is there hope? And we stand in the middle of that breaking ship, and we break bread, and we say, we can be thankful. God has provided life for us. If you believe the truth and you believe the source of that truth, there is life. But if you don't, like the centurion could have chosen not to listen to Paul, they would have been doomed from the start. Would have been doomed. I realize that's us. We are the Pauls on a shipwrecked boat of humanity. And sometimes you get to stand up on a stoop and preach big things about the gospel, and sometimes all you need to do is break bread with the people who are dying and say there really is hope. The God whom I serve, the God to whom I belong, says there's life, if you'll listen to what that word of life is. And we bring wisdom to life. I can save you the heartbreak of doing the wrong things if you just listen for a second to people who are just frantic trying to fix things. We bring truth that brings assurance to what's going on. Not truth that we generate, but truth that we get directly from God through his word. We also bring life, words of life. There is life in the midst of what looks like a dead-end death experience. There really is life. How can that be? Let me tell you, this comes from the God that I serve and to whom I belong. We bring encouragement where there should be no encouragement, because God encourages us through what he gives us in his word. And we bring thankfulness for a God who saves us out of the shipwreck of fallen humanity. That's it, right there. It's extremely simple. We're Paul in that sense. Now, before I leave that picture, is that your picture of where you live? Or is the picture of where you live, does it look like a placid little lake with everyone in their nice little boats? You know, yeah, utopia, everything's fine, floating around. What a wonderful place. Peace, happiness. It's actually this. In many ways, this is a perfect picture of what most people see their lives in. I'm just hanging on in this boat. But sometime it's going to strike a sandbar, I'm going to die. Sometime the boat's going to bust apart. We're taking on water. You know people that are around you are taking on water and think it's going to sink their ship? Because they're everywhere. In fact, you and I, in situations of life, have been busted in storms of life and wonder, is there a word of encouragement? Is there a word of assurance that God's love for me is more profound than the storm I'm going through? It's this. It's really this. So we get a nonverbal Paul mostly today because he wants you to speak the gospel because you're living on a sinking ship with people that need to hear encouragement. That's as simple as it gets right there. I'll tell you, when God showed me this, it just it took me apart. Because I'd rather think that the Christian life is where God puts out a dinghy on a smooth piece of water, and that's what we're all doing, is being on a smooth piece of water. But his choice is different. God could have taken Paul and got him to Rome without having him put him on this ship of death. But because of that, 276 people survived. And I have to think that somewhere later in life they said, you know what, I was caught in this ship that should have gone down. But there was this little man who said that he belonged to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who belonged to Jesus as that God, who said there was hope and there's life, and he gave me his assurance that God himself said we would live, and we lived. It was an amazing trip because this man spoke simple truth and had faith and encouragement in the midst of what should be the most depressing situation of our lives. And my prayer for you is that someone will say that about you. I lived next to this person, and when I told them about how my ship was sinking, they said, but there's life from this God who's proven himself over and over to me. If you give your life to him and you accept his truth, there's life. If you ignore his wisdom, you're headed for the shoals. You're headed for shipwreck. There really is truth, and that's all he wants from us. Okay. What happens? Just a little PS to end us up here. Well, where did he end up? Well, we got to jump into the first verse of chapter 28. If you look up there, they end up going to this tiny little island right there. 28 verse 1, when they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. They shipwrecked on Malta. Well, they didn't quite make it up to Italy, but they're a lot closer than when they started. And as a result, 276 people got the eye of their life into this little man's beliefs and this incredibly faithful God who would bring them through and was true to his word. Malta. Well, next week we've got to get out of Malta and get up to Italy. But as we do that, I just want you to keep thinking about that. Whether it looks like it or not, in the community, in the neighborhood, in the world that you live in, most people see life as a shipwreck in progress. They're smart enough to see down the road to realize that the whole thing's falling apart. The mast is falling off or throwing things overboard. And there really is no word of assurance of life. And yet God has put you on that shipwreck boat deliberately. But God, I thought things were going to be peaceful when I followed you. Well, they are, but you're going to have to be in a shipwrecked boat while you're doing it. Because there's people that need to hear that there's hope. That's it. They need to hear. That's where you live, right there. Shipwreck boat. Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for how your Spirit speaks to our hearts. Thank you for how your Scripture is indeed inspired, all of it. And Lord, I thank you for the convicting example of Paul in this boat to me and to us. That really our role many times isn't so much to speak much, but it is to bring you into the middle of the context of what looks like a hopeless existence, a ship that's breaking apart. It has no hope of floating beyond the next week or so. And Lord, forgive us when we look at those around us and just presume that they seem like they're sailing on placid seas. Because Lord, we know that in reality, in this fallen creation, the storms whip up a pretty good storm. And we're tossed pretty mercilessly. And in our anxiety and lack of appetite, we wither away and die. And wonder if there's a good word. Wonder if there's any hope. Wonder if there's any stability in the midst of storm waves like this. And Lord, you put us in the midst of that to say there is. There really is. And so, Lord, I pray you'd open our lips, open the actions of our hands, that through all that we do and all that we say, as we're on this ship that's sinking, that you would communicate through those who are so desperate to know that there is a solid rock in you, and that there is salvation in no other, and that there is assurance in your truth. Thank you for putting us exactly where you put us. We are not complaining about the shipwreck you put us on. But God, we are asking that you speak powerfully through us now. So thank you for this great example. In Jesus' name.